All right, next we're going to be moving on to the different types of prenatal testing that women may have to go through whenever they are pregnant. Some of this testing is just to check for the well-being of the baby safety, mom safety, and then there's reasoning behind these different types of tests. That's what we're going to look at right now. So the first test that we're going to look at is actually called an ultrasound. So this is a really common one. It uses sound waves to make a video image of the unborn baby. So typically, when you're going to confirm a pregnancy, they can listen to the heartbeat, and then as you get further on in there, depending on how far you go in, when they're confirming their pregnancy, you may also be able to see the image. This is what it's going to look like on a computer. Now, this is also going to be pretty far along in the pregnancy because you can distinctly see, like, here's the baby's skull, the profile of the baby, the nose, the mouth, arms, body, and things like that. This is how the actual test is done. There's a little like Doppler type piece on there. They squirt a really cool gel so the image can be seen better, and then they look all around throughout the uterus and the baby's growth. So it shows that the fetus is developing on schedule. It can also potentially detect birth defects involving the skeleton or other organs. And the great part about the ultrasound is that there are no risks to the mother or the developing baby. So ultrasounds are usually done 2, 3, 4 times throughout the pregnancy. Your basic ultrasounds are like this, and then sometimes you can get fancy and get the 3D or the 4D ones, where they actually take this full image here. Like you can distinctly see the baby sticking their tongue out, some of the more defined features of the baby. The next test is called the alpha fetoprotein, also known as the AFP. So it's a regular blood test performed on the expectant mother between the 15th and 20th week of pregnancy. Alpha fetoprotein, it's a protein produced in the liver of the fetus, but it shows up in mom's blood work. So they can just literally take mom's blood. They're not actually getting anywhere near the fetus at all. They're looking for this certain protein. What they know is that abnormal AFP levels can potentially indicate a possible birth defect. So if the levels are not in the appropriate ranges that they think, they may redo the test and just see if it was an off day. Or if the test is still showing up with the same type of abnormal levels, they will basically ask the mom if she wants to continue on with further testing. The further testing will be needed to determine if kind of just defining if there is going to be a birth defect or not that can't be seen on ultrasound. But um, the prenatal tests after this are based off of consent because of the risk that involved in here. So because it's just a real basic blood test, there's no risk to the mother and there's no risk to the fetus. Okay, so the next 2 tests that we're gonna talk about, they are not required during the pregnancy, they are completely optional because of the risks involved. So if the AFP testing back with abnormal letter levels, excuse me, they can go on to determine, okay, there might be a possible birth defect, there might not. So we may perform, what they call an amniocentesis. What they're essentially doing is they're taking a sample of the amniotic fluid, and then they're going to test it for specific birth defects. So they get an ultrasound to determine where the baby is sitting at. They then plunge a very large needle into the amniotic sac. They do pierce it through, they take some of the fluid out, and then they will test this fluid later on. So it's most often used to test for Down syndrome, and it's usually recommended for women over the age of 35. Through testing and data collection, they've seen that Down syndrome tends to happen more to women whose pregnancies who are over the age of 35 when they're pregnant. It doesn't mean if you're over the age of 35 and have a child, you're going to have a child with Down syndrome. It just means that you're more likely to. So the reason this is optional is because 1 in every 200 women who have this test done, it could actually lead to a miscarriage. Because remember, you are piercing through the amniotic sac, and that's something that it runs a lot of high risks. So this one is completely optional. Um, so if the AFP levels are abnormal and women choose not to have this done, some of the best ways that you can prepare for it is if you kind of just get into the mindset of preparing that I might have a child with a birth defect and just start researching and learning as much as you can, asking as many questions as possible. That way, if your baby is born with a birth defect, then you are prepared as best as you can be for it. Or if you're not, or if your child is not born with a birth defect, then you're just a much more knowledgeable person about pregnancy in general. The other test we're going to look at is called the chorionic villus sampling. So This is, again, another test that runs a lot of risk, which is also why it's optional. It does test for specific birth defects, and there's a whole list of them. What it does, it actually takes a small sample of tissues from the membrane that surrounds the fetus. So instead of this one being a gigantic needle, this is actually inserted vaginally up through. They're still using the ultrasound to see where the baby's at and to kind of see where everything is going. And they're going to be taking a little small, they're snipping a little small sample of the chorionic villi tissue. So they actually have to go around and go around the baby, work through without trying to injure or do anything that could potentially cause harm, take the sample out, and then extract it. There is a risk of miscarriage for the baby, or this could actually cause a birth defect um, from how it potentially is conducted if things don't go right. So again, this is another one that is optional, and so women can make that choice as well. So these are the four, potentially the four testing that's going to be done. The first two tests, the ultrasound and the AFP testing, is going to be done no matter what, just to make sure that everybody is as healthy as possible. And the other two become optional. The last part that we're going to look at, because we've looked at the development, we looked at how the baby is going to be growing throughout, how mom's going to be growing throughout, and then some testing and some of those birth defects we talked about. We're now going to be looking at early signs of labor. So there are about three early signs of labor, and they don't necessarily always happen in this particular order. The bloody show does tend to happen a little bit first, and then the water will break, and then contractions, or sometimes contractions will happen, and then the water breaks. I know movies always portray it as, oh my gosh, the water's breaking and it feels like you just emptied a bottle of water out. You have to immediately rush to the hospital. And that's not how it always is. The water breaking is different for each woman. Sometimes their water won't even break, that whenever they get to the doctors, they get settled in, they're checked into the hospital will actually go in and physically break their water for them. So the bloody show, it's an interesting name and it's the nickname for it. So I don't know what is kind of a little more uncomfortable to hear, the term bloody show or the term mucus plug. So I'll let you guys decide. But essentially, it's when the mucus plug that seals the cervix is released or it dissolves throughout. So think of it as kind of like a cork. It is at the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus, and the mucus plug is up there. And what it does is it makes sure that the fetus is protected against any type of bacteria that could potentially try to enter the uterus. So it's like a cork. It stops everything from trying to kind of go in there, and also stops the baby from trying to do early labor and things like that. So it's different for everybody when it is released and dissolved. It's usually seen as a few spots of blood, or it could be like a lighter pink discharge. But it does, like I said, prevents the bacteria from moving into the uterus. It could occur as early as a few days prior to birth, or like the day that you go into the full active labor. But for each person, it is different. So, what could potentially happen next, or third in line, would be that the water breaks. So it could be a small trickle or even a gush of fluid from the vagina. It's not like mom can stop it from happening. It's not like she's feeling like she's urinating and then she can literally use her muscles to contract it and stop urinating, anything like that. She doesn't really have control over this. It just means that the amniotic sac that holds fluid around the baby has broken, and then when that occurs, the expectant mother or father should do the following. They should note what time that happened, and then they should call their doctor or their midwife. What will tend to follow the bloody show, not necessarily the water breaking and then contractions. It could be the bloody show, contractions, water breaking. But essentially, with each contraction, the cervix becomes more and more open, and then contractions signal the first stage of labor. So, right now, we're looking at the signs of labor, and we're then going to move into the stages of labor. Contractions are essentially the tightening and releasing of the muscles of the uterus. It's trying to help mom by pushing the baby out internally while she bears down as she gets further along in her labor to push it out externally. So she's going to use as much of her energy and strength as she can, and then her body is trying to help her at the same time. So contractions are painful. They're not pleasant whatsoever. They start off not terribly bad, and then just each body is different, so it can progress super fast, or it can be like 36 hours of labor. So some women choose to use like an epidural, which would help with some of the pain. It doesn't completely take away the pain. It kind of drops it down to just feeling like kind of severe period pain, but it's more manageable than the full effect of a contraction. And the last thing we're going to talk about is that sometimes women experience false labor. So they feel like they're going into labor. They're kind of getting these abnormal cramps and things like that. If they've never had a baby before, it's really hard for them to determine if it's real labor or false labor. So false labor is also known as Braxton Hicks. It's quite common. Some of the reasons why Braxton Hicks may happen is that it can often happen due to dehydration. So much like your muscles cramp in your legs, or you get a Charlie horse in your ankles, or things like that. It could be that you're just dehydrated. So if mom's dehydrated, remember the uterus is still a muscle, so it still needs to be given water and things like that. So Braxton Hicks they're painless. They're more just uncomfortable, but they're painless. They're not regular or rhythmic. So real contractions go in a very specific type of pattern. It's just depending on how fast that pattern is depends on the woman, but eventually they will get into a pattern. Braxton Hicks, there's no pattern to it. They become increasingly stronger. Real contractions will. The closer you are to delivery, the more pain that you're going to experience. Okay, so here's your assignment. It's another drag and drop. So you're going to drag these to the next slide, or you have to cut them and paste them. So these are all characteristics that relate to the four prenatal tests that we just went over. Some characteristics are repeated because they apply to more than one test. So there's a reason why you see no risk to mom or baby, no risk to mom or baby. But those definitely do not go in the same column. So you'll drag and drop those into the correct columns over here. And then you've got just a couple of questions to answer afterwards over the early signs of labor. If you have any questions, email me or join the web meeting on Thursday.